Hello. Today I'm going to read a paper titled Musical Rhetoric in Sweelinck's Chromatic Fantasia. This is a paper that I read at the Music Theory Society for New York State 2016 meeting. I would like to begin by playing the opening of the Chromatic Fantasia. Please turn to the score on page 19 of the PDF handout. Note that each bar is counted double, and the organ in the recording sounds a half step sharp. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, humanism, religious reform, and the emergence of vernacular literature all influenced musica practica. These trends, together with the revival of rhetoric, set in motion music's gradual transition from a subset of mathematics to the realm of language, that is, from the quadrivium to the trivium. The so-called doctrine of figures, which arose in the late Renaissance, was the first attempt to explain music's new semiotic potential. Yet no definitive system emerged explaining how to apply rhetorical figures to music. This presentation attempts to address this issue. After establishing a broad historical context, I will offer a reading of Jan Pedersen Sweelinck's Chromatic Fantasia using rhetorical terminology drawn from contemporaneous sources. Modern scholars have noted that Sweelinck's fantasias, which date from the early 17th century, often divide into exordium, medium, and finis, a tripartite structure posited as early as the 16th century and based on rhetoric. Yet no author has examined the specific means by which Sweelinck unites musical rhetorical figures and form to create a compelling musical argument. In this presentation, I contend that three figures, stretto, suspension, and proportion, work to support the rhetorical function of the exordium, medium, and finis. In particular, a pair of four-voice stretti, termed pillars, simultaneously articulates the two principal divisions of the form and consolidates the three contrapuntal devices. The first part of this presentation addresses rhetoric. Traditionally, the art of rhetoric is divided into 5 canons, as shown in example 1. The canons outline the process of crafting a speech, from the initial selection of a topic to organization, style, memorization, and delivery. The first 3 canons, which address the written text, received more attention than the latter 2 in Renaissance textbooks on rhetoric. George Kennedy has argued that there is a tendency for written forms of rhetoric to displace oral ones. The same is true in music. Whereas counterpoint was originally an improvised art, it gradually became a written one. Factors influencing this transition include the rise of print culture and the emerging notion of the musical work as a unique object. The traditional Aristotelian division between content and form, outlined in the first 2 canons, is particularly relevant in analysis. In the rhetorical tradition, the content or topic for discourse was often borrowed. Such loci topici, or commonplaces, may include definition, cause and effect, or comparison. Example 18 in the appendix in the PDF shows 3 musical commonplaces in Renaissance instrumental music, among them the descending chromatic tetrachord of Sweelinck's Chromatic Fantasia. As Claude Poliska writes, Zarlino assumes that the composer, as often as not, starts with ideas of other known or anonymous composers, but this does not confer a license to plagiarize. Rather, it is a challenge to embellish familiar music with new treatments and elaborations. Embellishment falls under the third canon of rhetoric, elocutio. In a verbal context, elocutio deals with style and syntax as distinct from form and content. Style could be high, medium, or low, chosen to match the audience and occasion. In musical terms, Christoph Bernhardt makes a similar 3-part division of style in his 1657 Tractatus, each with corresponding musical figures. Example 2 gives the 4 figures allowed in Bernhardt's Stilus Gravis, which corresponds to the prima practica and the style of the Chromatic Fantasia. Bernhardt calls the figures licenses, or exceptions to normal rules of good writing. Just as figures of speech embellish normative speech patterns, so do musical figures ornament the strict style of vocal polyphony codified by Zarlino. These figures were systematized within the Musica Poetica tradition. Musica Poetica emphasized the rhetorical nature of music and viewed the musical work as a unique and lasting object. Nicholas Listenius was the first to describe Musica Poetica in 1537. He writes that Theoretica is the art of knowing, Practica is the art of doing or performance, and Poetica is that which strives neither for knowledge of things nor for mere practice, but leaves behind some work after labor. For example, when someone writes a musical song, the goal of this action is the consummated and completed work, for it consists in making or fabricating something, that is, a kind of labor that leaves behind itself, even after the artist dies, a perfect and completed work. Therefore, the musical poet is someone engaged in the occupation of leaving something behind. The rise of Musica Poetica supports Kennedy's claim that rhetoric tends to move from oral to written forms. It also contradicts Lydia Guerre's argument that the modern work concept arose in the early 19th century. I will sidestep this issue in the interest of time. Musica Poetica's emphasis on the written work developed in tandem with new forms of musical analysis. New analytical methods viewed music through a language metaphor and thus drew upon terminology borrowed from rhetoric, grammar, and poetry. One of the most obvious examples is that a speech and an imitative composition both treat a subject, or soggetto. The first known instance of a rhetorical figure being applied to music is Johannes Stomius's use of the term mimesis in 1537. In rhetoric, mimesis is the mocking imitation of another's mannerisms, but Stomius used it to refer to imitative counterpoint. Although the mapping of rhetorical figures or rhetorical terms onto musical ones was rarely a one-to-one correspondence, the practice of adopting rhetorical figures for music analysis and composition flourished, culminating in its early stages with Joachim Burmeister's 1606 Musica Poetica and Bernhardt's 1657 Tractatus. Theorists during this time not only characterized musical figures rhetorically, but adopted rhetorical terminology to conduct what we would call structural analysis. Example 3 shows the classical 6-part model for an oration, together with Gallus Dressler's analogous tripartite division of exordium, medium, and finis for music. Cicero, among others, described how one should establish authority or ethos in the beginning of a speech, use logical arguments or logos in the middle, and appeal to emotion or pathos at the end. My analysis of the chromatic fantasia combines Dressler's tripartite form with Cicero's descriptions and identifies musical figures in accordance with each function. The figures I will highlight were important to the genre of Fantasia. According to Peter Dirksen, the idea of Fantasia was central to the humanist aesthetic system, where it held the key to overcoming human limitations to create great works of art. One of the most important definitions of Fantasia comes from Michael Pretorius's 1619 Syntagma Musicum, which was written about the same time as the Chromatic Fantasia. He says, "A capriccio or improvised fantasia is when one undertakes to execute a fugue, or imitation, of one's choosing, but dwells on it only for a short time, soon changing to another fugue as it strikes him. For since no text is permitted with proper fugues, one is not bound by words. One may make as many or as few digressions, additions, abridgments, twists, and turns as one wishes. Such fantasies and capriccios are especially suited for demonstrating one's skill and artistry. One may employ without further hesitation anything that is permissible in music, such as suspensions, proportions, that is, augmentation and diminution, etc., as long as the mode and melody are observed and remain within their bounds." Pretorius's definition mentions the three primary contrapuntal devices in my analysis of Sweelinck's chromatic fantasia: imitation, suspension, and proportion, meaning augmentation and diminution. It is clear Pretorius was immersed in the rhetorical tradition because elsewhere in Syntagma Musicum he gives the first known instance of rhetorical advice for singers. But what about rhetorical figures in instrumental music? According to Tim Carter, once musical rhetorical figures became conventionalized in vocal music, they were able to operate without a text in instrumental music. Sweelinck's keyboard music often reduces to a stile antico vocal background with characteristically instrumental figuration, indicating an overlap between vocal and instrumental idioms. Sweelinck taught this style of keyboard polyphony to his numerous German students. Sweelinck was among the earliest teachers of international repute. A document from 1615 states that Andreas Düben's study with Sweelinck had been extended, quote, "so that Düben can learn his craft more effectively and perfectly master the art of composing and learn the art of fugal playing from the fundament." The fundament refers to this stock of imitative, sequential, and cadential formula taught in the context of keyboard improvisation. It resembles the motto of rhetorical pedagogy, preceptum, exemplum, et imitatio, that is, learn the rule, study an example, and imitate the established masters. Thus, the numerous organists who studied with Sweelinck were subjected to the same kind of internalization and embellishment of preconceived patterns that characterized the rhetorical curricula of the Lateinschule in Protestant Germany. But as composers published their works in greater numbers, the concept of fantasia changed from primarily an improvised oral tradition to a notated genre. This transition is consistent with Kennedy's theory that rhetoric moves from oral to written forms. Sweelinck used an unpublished treatise known as the Kompositionsregeln in his teaching. The treatise borrows large sections from the third part of Zarlino's Istitutione Harmonische, which deals with counterpoint. But the Kompositionsregeln makes no mention of musical rhetorical form or figures. Is it therefore inappropriate to apply rhetorical terminology to Sweelinck's music? This slide shows the only two surviving depictions of Sweelinck. Note the hand position in both images. In 1644, John Bulwer described how this position of fingers had a specific rhetorical meaning. Quote, "The two inferior fingers shut in, and the other three presented in an eminent posture in the extended hand, is a speaking action, significant to demand silence and procure audience." This implies Sweelinck intended that he, and by extension his music, should be viewed through a rhetorical lens. Let us now turn to the analysis of the chromatic fantasia. Example 4 is a large-scale plan of the entire piece. Gray sections indicate the four-voice subject stretti, or pillars. This term is borrowed from Vicentino, who likened a structural event in music to an architectural column. I term these pillars fuga realis, which is a figure from Burmeister's Musica Poetica, where it denotes overlapping imitation in all voices, or stretto. The pillars function to articulate the two divisions of the tripartite form, the division between exordium and medium, and that between medium and finis. In fact, the pillars represent the only repeated music in the entire piece. Example 5 shows the four levels of subject augmentation and diminution. The same four values, eighth, quarter, half, and whole notes, appear as ornamented suspensions in example 6 in the PDF handout. Example 7 gives the two fuga realis pillars. They encapsulate the three primary contrapuntal devices of stretto, suspension, and proportion because they contain instances of each figure. First, the passages contain the only instances of re-articulated suspensions in the piece, that is, Bernhardt's quasi-syncopatio. Second, the two pillars are the only instances of four-voice subject stretto. Third, the second pillar is a repetition of the first in diminution, which illustrates the technique of rhythmic proportion. Notice the 32nd note, flourish, which introduces the first pillar. 32nd notes are rare in the piece, and they seem out of place here. Perhaps they function to mark the pillar through contrast and rhythmic values. Please turn to the score on page 19 of the PDF handout as we listen to this passage. The recording begins in measure 51. Recall that each bar is counted double. I will now address the three sections of the tripartite form, beginning with the exordium. Example 8 is an overview of the exordium, which consists of a fugue with two countersubjects. Recall that, according to Cicero, one should establish authority in the beginning of a speech. This may include quotation of past authors or deliberate shows of modesty. Indeed, the subject of the chromatic fantasia is likely borrowed from previous sources, and the use of triple invertible counterpoint is a sign of contrapuntal authority. Taken together, the subject, countersubject 1, and countersubject 2 form what Peter Schubert and Massimiliano Guido term a contrapuntal box. A box is a set of melodies that work together in invertible counterpoint, forming the basis for an imitative composition. Example 9a in the handout shows the first contrapuntal box in the chromatic Fantasia. The only permutation of voices that will not work in invertible counterpoint at the octave is countersubject 2 in the bass, since it creates fourths with the upper voices, as shown in the slide. But Sweelinck uses this ordering of voices once in measure 29, it's example 9b. His solution is a combination of transposition and invertible counterpoint at the 12th, necessitating a few altered pitches. Therefore, it would seem Sweelinck made a point of utilizing this rather inconvenient permutation of voices, perhaps in an effort to demonstrate his authority as a master of counterpoint, in accordance with the goals of the exordium. Example 10 presents an overview of the medium. According to Cicero, the middle of a speech should appeal to the listener's logic. Recall that the middle of the traditional six-part dispositio included the confutatio, or rebuttal of counter-arguments. A musical rhetorical equivalent to a counter-argument is a counter-subject, and Sweelinck introduces several new ones in the medium. Burmeister writes that the purpose of the medium is also to place the subject in a new context, in essence, testing the strength of one's argument. A musical analogy for this procedure might be the use of rhythmic proportion, which first appears in measure 104 as subject augmentation. The medium should appeal to logic, and the musical figure most closely associated with logic is imitation. In 1690, Angelo Berardi compared musical imitation to a syllogism. A syllogism is a basic dialectical device in the form, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. For example, if Berardi compared imitation to a syllogism, and a syllogism is a logical device, then imitation is, at least tangentially, associated with logic. I have posited that imitation, specifically stretto, plays a key role in the chromatic Fantasia, yet it appears only once in the exordium in the Fuga Realis pillar. In contrast, stretto comes to the fore in the medium in accordance with Dressler and Vicentino's prescriptions. Whereas the exordium saw stretto applied to the subject, in the medium, stretto is applied almost exclusively to the counter-subjects. In only 2 instances does counter-subject stretto appear in all 4 voices simultaneously, as it does in the 2 pillars. This is shown in example 12 and 13. It seems Sweelinck is placing the counter-arguments under the same scrutiny as the subject in the 2 pillars in order to, as it were, test their validity. Brackets highlight each counter-subject, showing how both examples are based on similar motives. The first pattern is up a fourth, down a third, and the second pattern is down a third, up a fourth. William Porter calls such patterns generating principles, which are analogous to Andreas Döben's fundament. These principles formed the basis for both written and improvised counterpoint in the 16th and 17th centuries. For example, the down 3, up 4 pattern appears in a didactic treatise, or a keyboard treatise, by Spiridionis a Montecomello, dated from 1671, that's example 14. This is only one of several such patterns in the treatise, which are subsequently embellished in myriad ways. The ascending and descending chromatic tetrachord is even given as a model for embellishment. Spiridionis writes in the preface that the student should memorize these patterns and transpose them into different keys, eventually embellishing them as well. This practice has clear analogies with traditional rhetorical pedagogy. For instance, students of rhetoric kept books divided into two headings: common topics for discourse or content, and figures of speech or form. Students then applied the topics, they then applied figures to the topics in various ways, just as Spiridione applies figuration to the cadences, which represent fundament patterns. Another instance of fundament patterns comes from Santa Maria's 1565 Art of Playing Fantasia, example 15. The passages are four-voice steady in the patterns up 3, down 2, and up 4, down 3. One can generalize that any equal rhythmic values alternating the intervals n, n-1, or n, n+1 in opposite directions will yield a 3 or 4 voice stretto without dissonances. These stock patterns form the basis for improvisation at the keyboard, and the Fantasia in particular. Let's now listen to the first part of the medium, beginning on page 19 in the PDF handout, in measure 68 at the end of the exordium. Example 16 gives an overview of the finis. According to Cicero, the end of a speech should use emotional appeals in order to leave a lasting impression. Pretorius writes that, quote, "At the end of a fantasia, the first imitation is generally repeated, thus concluding the work." End quote. Johannes Nucius, who is in the generation after Burmeister, uses the term complexio to refer to this repetition of an initial passage at the end. The recurrence of the fuga realis pillar in diminution would seem to confirm Sweelinck's long-range planning in this regard. Sweelinck never repeats the initial contrapuntal box, but elements of countersubject 2 do return. Example 17 illustrates how a fragment of countersubject 2 in the exordium becomes countersubject 16 in diminution in the finis, where it appears in stretto with itself over the subject in the bass. I call this an instance of congeries, which is the rhetorical piling up of synonyms for emphasis. For example, the treatise Rhetorica ad Herennium gives the example of a prosecutor who says, "The defendant is the betrayer of his own self-respect, the waylayer of the self-respect of others, covetous, intemperate, irascible, arrogant, disloyal to his parents, and ungrateful to his friends. Congeries is a figure of pathos or emotion, so it fits well in the finis. Another instance of congeries is the double subject diminution beginning in measure 148 or 184 shown in the slide. Like the two pillars, these subject entries saturate the texture with chromaticism. This climactic passage serves to prolong and intensify the dominant pedal point, and an analogous passage immediately follows over a tonic pedal, together creating the most definitive cadential bass motion in the piece. Thus, the finis acts as a summary of the entire fantasia through the repetition of the initial pillar in diminution, while also reusing elements from an earlier countersubject in stretto. At the same time, the arrival of the subject in double diminution serves to leave a lasting impression, not unlike an orator who speaks faster and more emphatically at the end of a speech. Please turn to the score on page 21 of the PDF handout as we listen to the finis, beginning in measure 169 at the end of the medium. In sum, the repeated pillars serve to articulate the two divisions of the tripartite form, while also encapsulating the three primary contrapuntal devices of stretto, suspension, and proportion. The exordium establishes authority through the contrapuntal box in triple invertible counterpoint and use of a borrowed subject. The medium invokes logic by applying stretto to the counter subjects. The finis evokes emotion through congeries and double subject diminution. Thus, musical rhetorical figures and form unite to create a compelling musical argument. The goal of historically informed analysis, such as we have been exploring here, is to engage the sources as deeply as possible in order to establish the context and means available to the original author, while also recognizing that we cannot recover actual thinking from the past. Just as those who heard the ancient orators ultimately reached their own conclusions, so too will the past speak differently to each generation of listeners. Thanks very much for listening.